In Grave of the Fireflies, one of the things that strikes me immediately is the ability to capture through the lives of two children the experience of hundreds of thousands of people who endured that monstrous experience of being burned out of their homes, having been forced to live elsewhere with other people, having seen the death of many of their relatives, experiencing that horror. And then being able to reduce that story down to a way which could be used and understood by almost any person, any country, any nationality. It's a universal experience.
From those children's eyes, it really, I think, brought out the emotions, feelings, realities, sufferings.
The way in which strategic bombing has evolved is one of the key questions that makes the history of militaries so interesting and so dangerous. The notion that civilian populations were no longer immune from direct attack is a major traumatic lesson of the First World War. So in a sense, the idea that you might win, potentially could avoid the horror of the trenches by striking at the enemy heartland, is an idea which occurs to quite a few people quite early. In fact, Winston Churchill, however, argued that ultimately we know this won't work, back in 1917. One of the things that strikes me is that when bombs began to be employed, they were employed occasionally against civilian targets, and they're used primarily as a terror weapon. As the Germans began to bomb London, and the American public and the world publics began to pull behind the English, there were Japanese military observers on the ground there, looking up, taking notes and seeing what was happening. There were observers in almost every other country in London, the neutral countries. In London, Japan was still neutral.
Japanese leadership, military and political, knew really what would be happening to the Japanese cities prior to the real attack over Pearl Harbor. But 1944, they meaning military, began to build gigantic bunker in Nagano Prefecture, where the last Winter Olympic was held under the mountain, where the imperial families and also various leaderships and would go and hide and negotiate with enemy powers.
It wasn't even built as a command center so much as it was built as a safe place for the emperor. And luckily for the Japanese government, the initial efforts to bomb Japan were quite ineffective. This is something which, again, most Americans are unaware of. The day that the American forces landed on Saipan on June 15, 1944, was the first raids on home islands in Japan with B-29 bombers. The simultaneous, I'm not sure they were coordinated, but they were close to each other. But the raids came from China. And the air raids from China bombed Japanese installations, bombed Japanese factories. High-altitude precision bombing was the design of the B-29 airplane. It was supposed to do that. And the targets were factories in northern Kyushu, the southern island, the northern part of the southern island. But they couldn't hit the targets. There were all kinds of difficult atmospheric problems. There were all kinds of difficulties with the aircraft itself. It tended to break down. But also there were problems with the crew, the training of the crew, lots of issues that ultimately developed into a crisis for the High Command, because what they were trying to do was bomb from high altitude safely with a super airplane, the finest airplane that ever been designed, the most expensive weapon system of the Second World War, more expensive even than the atomic bomb project was this B-29. Now, what that meant with the Japanese public is they began to become used to raids that weren't terribly effective.
Air raid! Get to the shelters, quickly! We're in for a big one this time.
People are not concerned about the air raid. Maybe partially because they had so many things to worry about. What to eat tomorrow. Tomorrow's food, every mother had to worry about. Everything was rationed. So people are so occupied by really trying to live so-called normal life.
But the permanent, the horrible damage that we see in Grave of the Fireflies that strikes at home hadn't struck yet.
And people, in a sense, were supposed to be preparing for this. People are summoned to practice how to extinguish fires when the bomb dropped.
Yeah, we see that scene when Seta looks at them.
In that really animation, it's there with
Bucket of water.
bucket of water, tiny mop type
Spark fighter.
clothes.
Yes.
Yes, relay. So every woman probably who lived in urban area recall that exercise. They are summoned to participate, and they are told, you are not supposed to leave the house. You are supposed to defend your house on your own.
And I think almost none of the population could have imagined the scale of which the attacks that were unleashed on Tokyo, and then subsequently virtually every other major city in Japan would take. They didn't see themselves as the primary target. They didn't expect to be bombed out of their own homes. They would be defending their homes and their factories, which would be sort of collateral targets to the military targets they expected to be attacked. And that was the genius of Curtis LeMay's strategy from the point of view of the American High Command, is he was going to, as I think his own words were, something to the effect that we're going to disable the Japanese economy by inducing permanent absenteeism among the workforce.
Get out of here!
As American crews described the attack, the first planes that went in saw a big X marked out by where the bomb should be dropped by the Pathfinder planes, which was then followed by an increasing inferno as the pilots came in and passed over the target area. By the end, the American pilots are describing stepping into the jaws of hell. The flames are roaring upward and creating a hurricane. The plane was intensely hot over the ground. You can only imagine what it was like on the ground, because the people in the center of those infernos did not survive. Many of them, by the tens of thousands, were charred and disappeared out of existence.
Every household had a tiny air defense hideout type of thing, shallow hole under the floor.
Yeah.
But those defense mechanisms recommended by the government were totally useless. I met a woman who lived through this experience in Tokyo. She was about 10, coming back from her evacuation. The family tried to escape together, but it was impossible. But they survived that night. And next morning they find their way home, which was totally burnt down. And one by one, her family member made it back, exception of youngest brother who was on her mother's back. When her mother returned, she didn't have that boy on her back. Her mother kept silent about how she lost her own baby while she was running away. In this way, often we talk about really casualty of the air raid as numbers. We never know, really. We never know how many people died. Even lucky ones who survived this air raid really lived through with this pain.
The effects were so complete and so thorough, so devastating that Curtis LeMay, the commander of the units, was concerned that he was about to exhaust the target list. And he promised that the target list would in fact be exhausted by September 1st, 1945. So he was promising headquarters essentially that there would be nothing to bomb in Japan by that date. And that kind of overwhelming destruction, certainly sadly enough, but in an extraordinary way, had not forced the Japanese government to surrender. And this was a serious problem for the U.S. Air Force and the Army Air Force as it was planning its attack. So ultimately, even when the surrender began to approach, when it became clear that atomic bombs were going to be used, and they in fact then were used, the conventional bombing of Japan continued.
August 2nd raids over several cities were conducted to celebrate really 38th anniversary of Army Air Units, as well as General Curtis LeMay's celebratory transferring from 20th Air Force to the Chief of Strategic Air Force Unit, bigger job. So the damage created in Toyama, Mito, and other cities on this occasion was a celebration. Often I wonder how people really think in this way, even two nations at war.